Alrighty, guys. How are the levels on the microphone? Too soft, too loud? Just right? I'm going to take that as a just right. So, welcome to Urbit Brisbane, our second meetup. Slides are working, that's a good sign. Welcome to our live audience, those of you who were here last week, those of you who are newcomers, our live stream audience, people online, and anyone who might be watching this on YouTube later. Okay, let's get right into it. The internet sucks. It's like we're used to it, so we don't think about the fact that it sucks, but it really sucks. Let's look at why. Centralization of your personal data. So this is a server. This is rather a building in which servers live. So this is a warehouse that Google uses to store your data and lots of other people's data. And we don't really think about the internet as an industrial scale operation, but it is, and this is where it lives. And so when you're on your phone, you get this impression that you're interacting with people directly, or you're reading your emails directly. They're just there. But it's this marvelous illusion that UI, UX experts have created over 15 or 20 years to just give you this impression that it's happening right there on your phone or right there on your computer, when in fact it's on the other side of the world. And it's definitely not stored on your computer. So, another reason the internet sucks is the new platform problem. When a startup comes along and they say, look, we've identified a niche in the market, we're going to build this little product, it's going to solve this problem that this particular group of users have. We've done all our market research. We've talked to these users. Let's go for it. Assuming they can, build that startup, get seed funding, grow it into something, they're going to run into trouble on the user end, because even if their app is successful, it's added to this increasingly bloated dashboard or list of logins and passwords that every user has. Which brings me to the next slide. That your digital self that you have living across a multitude of platforms and social media platforms is fragmented. It's not in one place. Some of these apps and some of these companies talk to each other. Some of them are owned by the same parent companies, but it's not always the case. And so people here have probably had the experience of having a message thread to a friend in Facebook, another message thread to that same friend in Instagram, maybe one in Signal, a text message thread. And so your friends and family, you're keeping touch with them through multiple channels. You're sharing different aspects of your digital self on different channels. I was going to try not to mention LinkedIn, but I've just mentioned LinkedIn, but it's there as well, unfortunately. And we've got used to compartmentalizing our lives based on what we want to share on what platform. But really, we've adapted to the situation that comes as a result of this centralization of the data resulting from that client-server model, and then the fragmentation of the digital self when we look at things from the user angle. The panopticon, you might have heard this term before. A panopticon is essentially a prison in which you can be seen by everyone else in the prison, whether wardens, whether other prisoners. And I'm not the first person, far from the first person, to describe social media and the experience of being online in the 21st century as like being in a panopticon, because if you're not online in some form, people sort of look at you a little bit funny. They think maybe you've got a checkered past or even a checkered present. They think that there just must be some odd reason that you're not online like the rest of people. But some people find that experience of being online, being seen by everyone, to just be quite unnatural and in many ways quite bizarre. Sorry, I'm just hearing that there's a bit of an echo here. Just give me a moment to sort this out. Okay, so 1 2 1 2. So social media is to some extent a panopticon. It's to some extent a digital prison, but it's actually pretty comfortable there, and that's why most of us don't sort of, even if we know what's happening on the back end when we use services like Google, when we use Facebook, when we use Instagram, when we have these immensely personal, intimate conversations with our friends and family on these platforms, we know where the data lives. We know that we sort of really don't own it. We just sort of rent the rights to it. And in return, we give all of this additional private stuff, which we might not like to share if there were a better option. But because it's so comfortable in that prison, in that panopticon, we just tend to overlook it. And that brings me to another aspect of the online experience today, which is that it's like a hypermarket. And by a hypermarket, I mean perhaps an enormous shopping center. And that was never the original vision of the internet. It was not intended to be something primarily commercial, something a marketer's playground. But it's been entirely taken over by people who are trying to sell you shit you don't need. It's been entirely taken over by advertising, by marketing. You can't find interesting content because you're always going to find search engine optimized content. You're always just going to get the brasher, the louder, the more in your face stuff. And again, that's an internet that many people have grown up with and they're used to, and they've never seen anything different. But I can remember in my first years of high school, in the school library, there was actually an internet directory. I think it was called Jane's Guide or something, and it actually would be released each year, and it would have cool websites. You could look in this like a yellow pages, and you would have all of these interesting websites, and none of them were enormous platforms. None of them were tech giants. It was much more like a marketplace than an enormous shopping center or conglomerate. Now the big thing that for me of all of these factors on why the internet sucks, and not just sucks but like is harmful, is the effect that it has on our attention and the effect that it has on our brains. So this is an extract from an article that was published in The Atlantic. I'm just going to read a quote from it that I think is incredibly pertinent. Here is a fun product that millions of people seem to love. It's referring to Instagram. That is wholesome in large doses, that makes a sizable minority feel more anxious, more depressed, and worse about their bodies, and that many people struggle to use in moderation. What does that sound like to you? To me, it sounds like alcohol, a social lubricant that can be delightful, but also depressing. A popular experience that blends short-term euphoria with long-term regret, and a product that leads to painful and even addictive behavior among a significant minority. Like booze, social media seems to offer an intoxicating cocktail of dopamine, disorientation, and for some, dependency. Call it attention alcohol. And you might have seen articles like this. You might have seen them shared by a friend on Facebook, because that's one of the best ways for information to travel these days. And irony, well, we're just sort of so immersed in it that it kind of becomes invisible after a while. You just sort of lose track of it. Because social media companies are never going to stop you sharing information about how bad social media is, because they know that you don't really have an out. They know that you don't really have anywhere else to go. And even if you feel like you shouldn't be on there or you shouldn't be using that platform, it's still very difficult for you to get off there and have a real alternative to it. So moving on from this point in terms of attention, it's not just notifications that nag at you. It's not just keeping up with the Joneses or keeping up with your friends or your peers. It's the way that content is presented on these apps. And I'm thinking of Instagram specifically. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, said that you can never step into the same river twice. And I think that is especially true of the raging torrent that is any sort of content on a platform like Instagram or the Facebook feed. You're just presented with this never-ending stream of novelty, and it never stops. And the UX of the platform is kind of there to make you not feel too too sort of pummeled by the constantly new stuff crashing against you, but you're meant to sort of easily scroll to the bottom, except you never reach that bottom. You're kind of like a gambler at a slot machine, or like a docile cow at the feedlot. But the way that the content is presented, it's just this stream of novelty, and then once it exits that river, once it's old, it just goes into this vast ocean, and that ocean is really deep, and so it's really difficult for you to look at older posts. It's really difficult for you to go back through your memories because you're constantly fighting up. You're being pushed by all of this new content. And so Facebook will, in its helpful way, say, here's a photo of you and your ex having a great time from 8 years ago. Thought you might like to see this. Thanks, Facebook. That was very thoughtful. But there's not really a way in the user interface of these apps for you to access things that you like, that you would like to become familiar, in the same way that you might have a photo album, a treasured family photo album or even photos in frames around your house that are always on display, that are always visible, and that are not going to be replaced with new content. And so for that, I would call these bodies of content water, if we can call them that, lakes and ponds. So when you have still water, you can be meditative, you can be reflective. You're not disturbed by some new scandal or some new piece of information or some new thing of your friend hitting a new personal best at the gym or whatever it is you have on your feed. You can look at the things that you like and you know that you like and you know that you want to come back to. I'd say the app that is, or the platform that is closest to this at the moment is Pinterest, but it's more set up for graphic designers and wedding planners. It's not really an app for you to keep your personal things there. At least I don't really know anyone who uses it that way, and I don't feel the interface is really designed for that. And so several months ago, my friend Gus, so Gus lives in Victoria, and he really has been the person who has really got me from someone who had an Urbit Planet, had been on the network a few times, had tried it out, to a real enthusiast, and now probably a nut, or approaching that stage. And so Gus has been leading an app development project for an app that is called Post. Post is in postcard, and the concept of the postcard is it's something that you might put on your fridge. And so your fridge, we're switching metaphors here, but stay with me. Your fridge is like that lake, or maybe even a pond, just like a backyard fish pond. And that's a place for you to put family photos. That's a place for you to put postcards that friends who are traveling Australia or traveling the world are sending you. It's a place for things that are familiar, that are maybe not so private that you would put them in a drawer, but they're private enough in that people aren't just walking into your house and looking at your fridge, unless you're hosting an Urbit meetup in your garage, but no one would be crazy enough to do that, right? Moving on. So Post isn't finished yet, but you could call it a kind of permagram, because it's going to be less about instant gratification and more about the permanence of things that matter. And so we're really excited about that. Gus is still working out some technical stuff on the back end, but we're hoping that we will be able to do a bit of a launch party for that at one of our meetups early next year. Now, I want to talk about just a couple of terms that I've been thinking about in terms of how people on Urbit look at the future of the platform and the potential of the platform. It's not really a platform so much as a computer, but it can be easier to just people understand what you mean better if you say a platform. So I'll use that term as well. So the first is stargazing. When you're stargazing, well, typically you're someone who's been into Urbit for a while, and maybe you've invested in some address space, and as Urbit's getting more popular and more features are added and more apps are added and the user experience and the stability improves, you're seeing the value of that address space go up, and you're getting really excited about it, and you're saying Urbit's going to replace Twitter. You're saying Urbit's going to replace the whole internet. You know, the internet's obsolete. Urbit's here, like we're done. And you're kind of walking around and you're staring up at the stars and you're staring at this great potential. And I'm like that too. For me, there's this vast potential of Urbit, which we just haven't even scratched the surface of what is possible. But the second frame that I'd like to, the second way of looking at things is not stargazing. It's a bit more down to earth, and that's trailblazing. And this is a photo of Mount Zeal, which is 3 hours west of Alice Springs. And it's not an enormously tall mountain. It's about 1,500 meters above sea level, but there's no trail on there. And it's covered in loose rocks, it's covered in spinifex, it's quite inhospitable terrain, and it can get quite hot there if you're not sort of there in the dead of winter. And if you're there in winter, it can get to below freezing. So it's a tough one to climb, but when you're climbing it, you see places in which a trail has started to emerge, where there's a flattened spinifex bush and you know that someone has been there before. And I think that's what we're starting to do with Urbit, because right now a lot of people on the network, they're early adopters, they're kind of rugged individualists. There's something that has brought them there. Maybe they're early adopters. They want to see what it's about. And I think we need to think about the paths that we're traveling and how we're turning them into trails, because climbing Mount Zeal is not for everyone. If there were a trail there, it would be more accessible to people. And ultimately, Urbit has a lot of address space. It's got 4.3 billion planets on there. So, yes, people who are rugged pioneer types often want to keep the pristine wilderness for themselves, but if we want Urbit really to come into its power and to come into its value, we need to look at how we can make that experience for people getting up there a little bit less daunting. Now, this next little bit is a bit of a personal story, but it's something that I wanted to share tonight, and we'll see where it goes. So this is my grandmother. This is Coral on the left, obviously, and Coral passed away in May of this year, and that on the right is her. Well, a representation of her 2011 Mac Mini. And this computer was just like this demonically possessed beast that she grappled with every day. Coral had been a computer user since the early 2000s. She actually was a self-publisher. She published a quarterly writing magazine. She had written a couple of books, including a novel. And so she was good at word processing. She was good at keeping in touch with her many friends around Australia and around the world with email. But as she started to get older, and I'm talking into her early 90s, she was still using email, she was still using Gmail, and she was still using Word for word processing. She found that each successive update, not just of the Apple operating system, but also like a new Gmail refresh, where a new look was brought out, she couldn't turn these things off. And she had to keep updating the operating system, because if she didn't update the operating system, she couldn't update the browser. And if she didn't update the browser, she couldn't access Gmail in some cases. And this process was maddening to her. And I'm going to tell you why in a second. But it wasn't just my grandmother. It's a lot of older people. And I've done a little bit of volunteering work for an organisation called Brisbane Seniors Online. And I've really only had a few BSOL clients. But what I've noticed with many of them, there's this common thread that when something changes, when new things are added to an interface, or it gets an update to the design language, that is just this terrible invasion of privacy to older people, because they feel like someone has come into their room and rearranged the furniture when they're not home. And they've got used to the layout and they've memorized it, and it's almost like they've learnt it by rote. And they don't have this intuitive understanding of the elements that make up a user interface, like modals or dialog boxes or hamburger menus. And you guys might not know what these are called either, but you recognize these common symbols, you know generally where to look for them, and you have this kind of this intuitive ability generally to figure things out pretty quick. Older people are not like that. They don't have that same embeddedness of the abstractness, especially the abstractness of modern flat design. It just doesn't seem to fit in their heads in the same way. It just doesn't seem to stay in their heads in the same way. And as they get older, they don't want to keep learning these new things, and their neuroplasticity is declining. And so the problem is that the digital products that are made, any digital product, is not made concerning old people. It's made to maximize novelty. The UI UX designers or the product managers at a company are always going to push for more features. They're always going to push for newer stuff. They're always going to want to test stuff. And they don't have any regard for people who just want things to stay the same. And so I've said before that Urbit should be for everyone. Urbit should be for grandmothers as well. Now, I've tried tonight to give you a bit of a bit more of an exploratory sort of presentation. Last week's was more explanatory. So if it is your first time tuning in, or if it's your first time to the meetup, you probably have a lot of questions about how Urbit actually works. We will have a Q&A afterwards. That won't be in the live stream, unfortunately. We're looking at putting that into future live streams, but certainly there are plenty of resources out there on how it works. But what I wanted to do tonight was just show you why I believe in Urbit in the long term. And Mr. Nietzsche here, who, you know, it's a bit, again, a little bit crass to say this, but I think if he were around today, he definitely would be an Urbit user, and we'd have an endorsement from Mr. Nietzsche. But yeah, so maybe you don't hear the music yet, and if you're one of the people that I've been ranting and raving to for the past few months about Urbit, you might think I'm a little bit insane, but I've tried to unpack some of that apparent insanity a bit tonight. So maybe you're starting to hear that music a little bit. I hope so. Something a bit closer to home, it really is the vibe. That's what I'm trying to go for here. again, my presentations, these meetup presentations, at least for the near future, are not going to be technical. I'm going to look at pairing up with some of the other members of Australia to get some proper boffins in the room, some real technical guys who can answer the programmery, yeah, that's a word, those programmer questions that you might have if you're a technical person and you want to get started, maybe programming in Hoon, or you just want more of an explanation as to why, Urbit is a good competitor to Web3, for example. So that's something we'll definitely work on. But for me, Urbit is a vibe. Okay, the pizzas are on their way, I think. I'm getting the nod from Emil, so that's good. The presentation's almost done. I just wanted to read for you guys a poem that I think kind of, for me, Urbit is about the long run. And when I think about how it has the possibility to really rehumanize computing by getting us away from these entrenched 20th century corporate structures, megacorps, tech companies, which are kind of in this awkward space between the industrial age and the information age. The internet needs to be dragged kicking and screaming, if need be, fully into the information age, and then we can look at how to make that more human, because that seems really unlikely to happen with the current foundations that we have. It's not a matter of, making things meta and putting on a VR headset. The foundations are just not there. And if you think about, if Urbit had even a 10,000th of the money and the man hours and woman hours as well, and effort and investment that the mainstream net has had poured into it, or that platforms on the client server model had poured into them, it would already be incredible. And we hope that that's going to happen. I feel strongly that is going to happen. More than just a 10,000th, much more. So let's get on to it. This is by C.P. Cavafy, a Greek poet, and it's called Ithaca. As you set out for Ithaca, hope your road is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery. Laestrygonians, Cyclops, angry Poseidon, don't be afraid of them. You'll never find things like that on your way, as long as you keep your thoughts raised high, and as long as a rare excitement stirs your spirit and your body. Laestrygonians, Cyclops, wild Poseidon, you won't encounter them unless you bring them along inside your soul, and unless your soul sets them up in front of you. May there be many summer mornings when, with what pleasure, what joy, you enter harbours you're seeing for the first time. May you stop at Phoenician trading stations to buy fine things, mother of pearl and coral, amber and ebony, sensual perfume of every kind, as many sensual perfumes as you can. And may you visit many Egyptian cities to learn and go on learning from their scholars. Keep Ithaca always in your mind, but don't hurry the journey at all. Better if it lasts for years, so you're old by the time you reach the island, wealthy with all you've gained along the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. Ithaca gave you the marvelous journey. Without her, you wouldn't have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca won't have fooled you. Wise as you will have become, so full of experience, you'll have understood by then what these Urbits mean. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks for tuning into our live stream viewers. I hope everyone has enjoyed the presentation, and stay tuned for more Urbit Brisbane meetups in the new year. Signing off.